as functions of a mind. You can't take a concept and then reify it to turn it into a thing just because we have a word.
Yeah, hit pause here at this. This is something else that he said in debate when he said 2 plus 2 equals 4 was not true in the time of dinosaurs. And I wish I had jumped on this more, because what that tells me is really there are no eternal truths whatsoever, which means the claim X is evil is also not an eternal truth, which means all his complaints about God at that point go right out the window entirely, because you can't say that there are no truths outside of us. All of this is just a function of our mind, and God is evil. It doesn't work that way.
All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Unapologetic Apologists, where we discuss big ideas in apologetics and philosophy. Super excited to have my next guest on. You can check out our stuff at deeperwatersapologetics.com. Nick Peters, thank you so much for being here, brother.
Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, yeah. So I guess before we get started, to people who maybe don't know of you yet, maybe you could just give us an introduction of yourself, how you came to Christ, and what got you interested in apologetics.
Well, I came to Christ at the age of 11 at a Baptist church I was attending for the first time, because that's the church my friends were going to. And what got me into apologetics was just being in Bible college. There was a much longer story behind it, but I was on the internet talking with atheists a lot, and I realized I needed to learn how to answer them. And first book I read was Morgan the Carpenter, which I thought was good, but the book I said lit my fire was Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. I've been doing this for about 20 years now. I'm married. I live in the Atlanta area. My wife and I both have Asperger's. I have my own podcast, my own YouTube channel, my own blog. And I should stress on, because there's one question people always ask me about myself. There's a lot of confusion about it, so I want to be clear on this one because it's so important. I do affirm the virgin birth.
Yeah, absolutely. I did too. I was actually just reading Jesus Among Other Gods.
The virgin birth, which I do affirm.
Yeah, I affirm it as well. Ravi Zacharias, I was reading one of his books, and he was talking like there's actual historical evidence for the virgin birth. I thought it was really interesting. And he was saying even the Quran, which comes 600 years later, they don't even say that Muhammad was born of a virgin, but even they attest to the fact that Jesus was virgin born.
And
so I found that really interesting.
Sinless, and that Jesus was the Messiah.
Yeah, and that all of a sudden it comes to his death, and they're out for some reason. So, but I'll take the Gospels because they were written way earlier.
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, I know you are really known for evidence for Christ, and we were going to go that route. Maybe we can do that in a future episode. But for this episode, I was actually watching a debate you had with Dan Barker. Yes. And I thought it was your first debate, if I'm correct, right?
The first live debate. Audience. I've done radio debates before, but this was the first one done before an audience.
Yeah. Well, so what was that like? That shift? Would you say there was like more nerves kind of going on?
Yeah. It's pretty interesting. I mean, when I did a debate against Ken Humphreys on the existence of Jesus, I was kind of nervous, but my own personal mentor, I'm not going to say who he is, but most people in apologetics would know him, told me, Nick, you got this. Go in there. And that's exactly what I did. But coming up to the debate, I had a couple months to prepare for it, and I've debated people like Dan Barker for years on the internet. This was going to be the first time that it'd be before an audience with peering eyes watching me directly. And for some reason, that got me nervous, and it's really strange. All that day, I was extremely nervous until I got up behind that podium and started speaking, and boom, everything went away. As I tell people, I was in the game at that time, and being a gamer, still to this day, I play to win.
Right on. Yeah, and I thought you did an excellent job. So what was that preparation like? Because as you said, Dan Barker's less like someone like Graham Oppie, a really sophisticated thinker. He's more like the typical internet atheist you might encounter in the comments section.
I got in touch with a number of philosophers and historians that I trust on various issues, and they gave me some preparation tips. Braxton Hunter actually did some mock questions with me to see how I'd answer them. I read several books and going to the library, including Edward Fesser's newest book on 5 Arguments for the Existence of God. I went and ordered all the books by Dan Barker that I could, but I hadn't read, and looked through them. I had a PowerPoint there, but I couldn't seem to get it to work. I had extra materials from there. If I needed to, I had different slides on different atrocities of the Bible, and even some on abortion, because I think this is a big contradiction in Dan Barker's world. But in one of his books, he makes a case in defense of abortion, but then you go to the Bible and he says, look at these kids being killed.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I noticed, because and we'll get into the debate after this. One of the things, because, you know, an argument like the one you used from Ed Facebook, it's very philosophical. You know, it can be really hard for, you know, people, especially who are new to it or aren't familiar with that kind of language, to grasp. But I thought you did a great job of communicating it. But Dan Barker just gets up and he's like, oh, this is just words. This isn't evidence. He's just using words. And I'm thinking, well, all of it's just words. You have to use words to communicate an argument.
My argument or something instead. I mean, what else am I going to use? It'd be a pretty interesting debate if I got and just did the whole thing in sign language.
Yeah.
I mean, that's actually what I think I said with Joiner. Of course, it's words. What else am I going to use?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny. I think what that kind of appeals to in people is there's this tendency to think science is if you use science, that's like concrete, that's like something we can look at. But philosophy, that's just kind of pie in the sky thinking. It's like, but the philosophical arguments, in my opinion, are much stronger, because you can, first of all, it undergirds science, and second of all, like, I think therefore I am, it's an obvious one, but it's one thing you can't get to with science, and it's more true than things against science.
Yeah, and the science of today, there are some things that we are absolutely sure of in science. You can't prove them in science, just like in history, but we're absolutely sure of them.
Yeah.
There are a lot of things that are subject to change, and even things we're sure of, they change to degrees. Like, we have different theories on the electron, for instance, what it is. That's changed in even 50 years or so. But an idea like it's wrong to torture babies for fun has never changed. Of that one, we are actually more certain of us. I'm certain of many more truths, much more than I am of many scientific truths.
Yeah. And in fact, if you couldn't be sure of those truths, like, I think therefore I am, logic is consistent, mathematics isn't just a mental construction. If you couldn't be certain of those things philosophically, then you couldn't even do science. It would just, you have to throw it all. It's all out the window. So yeah, I'm going to bring in here. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
There are some atheists like Massimo Pigliucci that have written condemning this mindset of scientism. You know, it's pretty obvious. People say if you are argue against scientism, you argue against science. Now, no one should argue against science, well, in the sense that no one should say science can't teach us anything. Of course, you can argue against scientific theory. Scientists themselves do that. But no Christian should be anti-science, because all truth is God's truth.
Absolutely. Amen. So yeah, I'm going to bring in the debate here. And just so people don't get the wrong impression, I'm not doing this because I thought that your performance was inadequate in any way. I thought you did a spectacular job. But unfortunately, the way the Q&A got set up was somebody would ask you a question, you could respond, and then Dan Barker would get a response to your response, and he would just lambast you with all these things. He's really good at saying a lot in a short time, and unfortunately, you didn't get a chance to respond in real time. So I thought this might be a useful opportunity to get to see some of those things. So this is right after the first question you had answered. Someone asked you about the problem of evil, and you gave a really good response to it. And all of a sudden, Dan Barker is about to misrepresent you. So let's see how this goes.
So God is causing earthquakes and tsunamis and diseases and disasters and famines so that other people can learn a good lesson from that. That's what you're saying, basically. No. That's what you just said, that there would be some good to come from it. With that kind of thinking, you have no basis for morality at all, because anything then could be good. I would challenge Christians to name something that would actually be really bad, other than what the Bible says, and you're misunderstanding Job. The book of Job is, sure, it's about obedience because the people who wrote that book wanted them to be obedient. But the point of my argument with Job is that God himself admitted that he destroyed him and he killed his 10 children who were not replaced, by the way. 10 new ones came along. He said he did it for no reason. There's no moral lesson in the book of Job at all. Look at it. The only moral lesson there is God's powerful. He can do what he wants. Shut up and just praise him. That's all there is in Job.
Well, that's certainly not all there is in Job.
Yeah.
But he misunderstood something very fundamental, I thought, there when he said anything could be good according to that standard. It's like, we're not saying that something is good because it's used for good, but that even evil things, which we all acknowledge are evil, God can use them for his good. And he has to if he's going to allow for free will.
Yeah. And I remember being on someone's Facebook post recently talking about the people God uses, and said, yeah, God uses inadequate, imperfect humans because there's nothing else to use with this. And no one is at all saying everything is good. That's ridiculous. The promise in Romans 8:28 is saying all things work together for good to those that love the Lord. Which means if you love the Lord, whatever happens in your life, it will be used for your good. Eventually, in gaming terms, I refer to it as the ultimate cheat code.
I like that. Yeah. And he makes an insinuation that it's somehow immoral if God uses one person's pain for another person's gain. And I just don't see that at all. I mean, if God lets me go through something, and maybe I never see the reason for it in my lifetime, but if it can be for the good of someone 1,000 years from now, that's absolutely God's right and his prerogative to accomplish his will in that manner. And when he says there's no moral lesson in Job, it's almost like he didn't even read the book. And if I didn't actually know that he, had been a Christian and did read it, I would think he hadn't read it, because Job's friends all bring to him all these same kinds of accusations from so many different perspectives, like one like Dan Barker might question. But there is a lesson in that, Job's answer is, Lord, I had heard about you with my ears, but now I've seen you and I abhor myself. He recognized through God's light that he was wicked and he was sinful, and he chose to put his trust in God in spite of all the terrible things that befell him. And that is a moral lesson. Dan Barker can brush it off, but he's just wrong.
Yeah. I mean, the thing about what God can and cannot do is such a huge dilemma. And sadly, I think many Christians get this one wrong as well. I don't think it's proper to speak of God as moral or immoral, because morality is doing what someone ought to do. But God has no ought. There is no rule book above him that says, well, God, this is what you need to do to be a good God. What God does is good, but it's not something that it's like he ought to do in the sense that he has an obligation to. And this is something very important to keep in mind. God has no obligation to any of us except for in the case that if he's promised something, he will hold true to what he said. And when we talk about lives being taken, this is something to keep in mind. We have no authority to take a life without due cause. God, on the other hand, owes none of us life for any moment whatsoever. And he can take it if he wants to. And what grounds can we say you're doing something wrong here? They really don't exist.
Yeah. And as you pointed out earlier, it's quite the ultimate irony when one charges God for being immoral for taking lives, but then they think when it comes to abortion that they can take the moral prerogative on themselves and take life. But it's apples and oranges. We are not the author of life, so we have no right to take it. But God is the author of life. So he has every prerogative to do, especially because of his promises in the Bible. We know that even things that seem unjust in this life, or that we experience great evil, that he is preparing us for a greater glory. So, absolutely God's prerogative. And we know he's not just, willy-nilly making snap decisions based on his emotions that day, Yeah. All right, so let's go right into the next one.
Next question.
Yeah, this question is for both the panel. If there is a God, why would he tolerate, or some might argue, encourage his human creations to commit war, genocide, and just wreak death and destruction in the world? Thank you. Thank you.
Who do you want to take that first?
I was aiming at both of you guys.
Well, I think it's aimed at you.
Yeah, I figure I'd take it first. Well, it depends on the cause. And depends on what exactly we're going for. I think most of us would say going into World War II and stopping Hitler was highly justified. I think most people today would say the Civil War was justified in ending slavery, for instance. War can sometimes be justified if the cause is a good cause that we should be fine with. It doesn't mean how we fight for it is right. It doesn't mean the methodologies we use to fight for it is right. But it means the cause can be right. Like, I'm normally a kind, peace-loving guy. I can assure you that. But there is a rule, for instance, on my Facebook page. This is a hidden rule. If you disagree with my wife on something, that's fine. You can argue with her all you want and such. But if you dare show up and insult her, you will know what war looks like at that point, because I will show up and my claws will come out in tally, and I will have no mercy. I think sometimes war is allowed because there are evil people in the world, and evil people do need to be stopped sometimes. Not all wars are right, but some are. I mean, the Crusades, for instance, when they first started off, they started because Jerusalem was being besieged by Muslims, and the people were being killed and enslaved and everything else. And Mary said, give us help. I think most of us would agree that's a good cause for help. Did everything go right after that? Well, no, sadly. But it depends. If we say all war is wrong, I think we have a problem, because then we have to say World War II was wrong, the Revolutionary War was wrong, the Civil War was wrong. If we say all war is right, well, then anything becomes justifiable. It depends on the action itself, the desired outcome of the action, and why we're doing it in the first place.
If the concept of a just war is meaningful, and I'm not going to argue that, it would be with the intention of trying to minimize overall harm. It would not be with the intention of trying to maximize overall harm. I think you agree with me that a defensive action, if somebody's attacking you in your home, you have the right to defend yourself with the minimal amount of force required to stop the threat. But the God of the Bible committed genocide with the intention of maximizing overall harm. It wasn't because those Canaanites were any worse than the Israelites. He said, kill them all, the babies, the children, the animals, everything. In fact, Saul was chastised for keeping a few animals alive, and he lost his kingship over that. So he was clearing out that whole ethnic cleansing so that his bride, the Israelites, would have a love nest to live in where they would worship him and him only, like an abusive, controlling husband that says, you look at me, don't look at any other idols. He's a jealous, mean, genocidal God. Maybe your argument has some sense today if we're defending ourselves against an aggressor, obviously. But the God of the Bible, if that fictional character existed, is not following that model that you use. He's maximizing harm. He's threatening with pestilence and bloodthirsty and with fire. So in my opinion, with the moral judgment that I have, he's not worthy of my admiration.
Well, Dan, I'm not sure I'm going to judge God based on your moral judgment. I think that's very risky. There's so much there to get to. Number one, he just says the Canaanites were no worse than the Israelites were. Well, yes, they were. They were murdering their babies and sacrificing their children to Molech. So yeah, God was perfectly just in taking them out, and it had nothing to do with ethnicity. If you look all over the Old Testament, there's plenty of rules on how people from other tribes can come into the Israelite tribe, but they have to adopt the Israelites' practices. So it's nothing to do with ethnicity. It has to do with the fact that they're murdering their own babies. And so, yeah, God is perfectly just in sending in people to take them out.
And that was limited to one group of people in one place at one time specifically. Now, if you go to the Quran, that's not limited in that way. But the conquest just meant that, and Israel wasn't supposed to go beyond its borders and conquer other lands that same way. I think that's one of the reasons that King David got punished for his census, because why do you take a census? So you can go to war. And why are you going to war? Well, maybe you're going so you can conquer someone else.
Yeah. And I really, really, really like the example you gave of World War II and the Civil War,
Yeah.
because obviously we all recognize that there are just words, and we have to have a consistent basis of truth. I think that's one thing that's lacking today. People don't know what to condemn and what not to condemn, and it's because they don't have a consistent basis of truth to operate off of. So we're struggling with that today.
Mhm.
And even if we can recognize that, obviously, going to war against Hitler is justified and the moral thing to do, well, then how much more justified if we have an all-knowing God who is the arbiter of whether or not we should go to war? That's a much better basis for morality.
Mhm.
So that's-
Yeah, I'm not sure what more you want me to say to something like that.
Yeah.
Hi, I have a couple of questions for both of you. First of all, I want to give both of you the respect for being here. And number one, the guy with the brown outfit and the glasses, I didn't get your full name. Could you please repeat that?
Nick Peters.
Nick Peters, thank you. I have a question for you and Dan Barker. First of all, for you, Nick, number one, if there is a God, why did he allow the 6 million Jews to be murdered by Hitler?
Mm-hmm. You know, we have something interesting. Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, I don't know on a particular evil. Here's what you've proven by that. You've proven I'm ignorant on a particular evil, but I don't know everything. And if you wanted to know I'm not omniscient, my wife's sitting right there. She could tell you I'm not omniscient very quickly. In fact, why did this tragedy happen? Because there were evil people, and I don't think it's God's responsibility to step in and do everything for us like that. We can't have this idea that God has to do everything. We're the ones that we're told to go out there and do the work to stop evil, to spread the good news of the kingdom and such, and not tolerate it when evil people rise up. There's the old question of someone asking, I'm going to ask God when I get to heaven why he didn't do anything about all the evil in the world. You would probably, I'm not going to ask him that one because I think he's going to ask me the exact same question. Evil itself doesn't disprove the arguments, but all the evil does show that we want something to change. We have an idea of how the world should be different. C.S. Lewis's argument, problem of pain and such. Again, I recommend reading Clay Jones, but remember, if atheism is true, most Jews died a meaningless death anyway. But if Christianity is true, the law of good can come from that. We've since learned a whole lot. We don't want to repeat that evil and such, although I think we are repeating it today with abortion, sadly. Look at some works of Viktor Frankl and Corrie ten Boom coming out of the Holocaust and all the things that they learned from it and such. So that would be my answer. And you have a question for Dan?
Well, I would just say
Okay.
to you, Nick, that is not nice to say that they died a meaningless death. But
It's true.
anyway, going on to Dan Barker.
Could she ask two questions in a row, or should I just respond to her?
Do you
first
want to
question?
go ahead?
Let Dan respond to the first question.
So basically, your answer, Nick, was very amoral. There seems to be no moral compass or guideline in your mind to decide what is good and what is bad, because according to you, if we had a bigger picture, anything could actually be good. If I were a good God, I would have stopped the Holocaust. If I were a good God, I would have given those 9/11 pilots heart attacks or something. Suppose you were standing there, Nick, on 9/11. Suppose with no risk to yourself, you could have stopped.
All right, I do want to let it play out, but I have to cut him off there because it's so much. First of all, again, he misunderstands the difference between evil being used for good and that making the evil good itself.
Yeah.
And saying you have no moral compass. She can say if she wants, it's not nice for you to say it's meaningless, but on atheism, that's the harsh truth that we have to face.
Yeah, I never said that their lives were meaningless. Of course not, but I said if atheism is true, then I'd say yes, their lives are meaningless. But if atheism is not true, then it could be their lives do have meaning. And if Christianity is true, every single life has meaning. So really, I don't understand how these people get there and hear something exactly opposite of what I've said.
Yeah, and two, then Dan Barker says, well, if I were God, I would have stopped it. Well, first of all, we actually can make the argument that God did stop it because the Americans did go in and put an end to it. The question would be, well, why did God let it get so bad before it was stopped? And Dan Barker can say, well, if I was God, I would stop it. But guess what? You're not an omniscient being, Dan Barker. You don't know what good could possibly come 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years from that. You don't know that how their souls are going to be justified in the afterlife.
Yeah, I think the whole thing about if I were God is absolutely ridiculous for any one of us to say. So I tell people, like, if you were God, everything would be the exact same way it is right now. Everything.
Yeah.
Because you'd have all wisdom, all knowledge, you know the present, past, and future. All we know right now is the present and the past. I mean, my ministry partner has said something like that. Suppose God gave a command to someone to kill all left-handed people he could find. We don't know why we're given that command, but we're absolutely sure we're given that command. And then we find out that God knew that a virus was going to come to Earth that would turn all left-handed people into indestructible flesh-eating zombies. All of a sudden, that seems pretty justified at that point. I mean, I think it's a ridiculous premise, but it's something that makes the case that we don't know why these things happen, and we don't know what's going to happen with it. I mean, you can see this in pretty much any sci-fi movie that deals with time travel or anything like that. But if you go and you change one thing that seems even tiny in the past, it has huge ramifications later on.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes in some TV shows, I don't even think they're trying to make a Christian point. I think they accidentally make a Christian point. But sometimes when they do change something and everything's completely different, sometimes even worse evil is what occurs.
Oh, yes.
So I think that's a very strong argument.
Mm-hmm.
And it just, if you were God, there's a famous quote about that too, where if God gave me his power, you would see how much evil I would stop. But if he gave me his wisdom too, I would leave things exactly how they are. I can't remember where I'm getting that quote from, but yeah, it's not mine.
I can't, but I actually, in looking at something like this about what we would do if we were God, I mean, when the movie was first coming out, I thought it seemed sacrilegious at first, but I actually saw Bruce Almighty twice in the film, and I think it made the point excellently.
It did.
I mean, you got guys just answer all prayers, yes, and look what happened.
Yeah. And two, one thing that's just an interesting philosophical point is if you were God and your goal was, well, I'm going to stop as much evil, you'd find yourself very quickly ended taking all human freedom away. Because you might start with Hitler and you might start with the extremists, but then you see a serial killer and, well, you have to stop him too. And then you see a person stealing and you have to stop. And eventually you just have to take all free will away because all of us are wicked at heart.
My wife is a huge fan of anime, and she really likes this series called Death Note. And so our first Valentine's Day together as husband and wife, I gave her the complete series on DVD because, nothing says I love you like Death Note. But it's a really interesting idea that a person gets this folder from the other world, and I'm not going to go into detail what that other world is, but it's kind of a world where these death gods live, and it's a death note. And if you write someone's name in it with a person's face also in your mind, that person will die within a certain amount of time. And if you want to, you can write down the circumstances of how they are going to die.
Oh, wow.
And this one kid, he's like this high school honors student, brilliant student, son of a police chief. He gets the death note, and he starts with taking out all the criminals that he can, which is where we would start, where the police start investigating this. They bring in a great detective, and before too long, several other people besides criminals are dying because this guy has to protect himself. And he tells this death god, who's his companion on this, he says, I'll be the god of a new world. And he says, well, aren't you then just becoming what you hate? Something like that. It's very philosophical to look at that series.
Yeah, I think often artists, even if they wouldn't call themselves Christians, I obviously couldn't speak for their personal lives, but because we've grown up in the West, which has such a Christian influence on our upbringing, artists, I think, have just a natural knack of kind of communicating these deep ideas without even knowing it. I think it's just kind of inbuilt into us. So yeah, there's a lot more I want to get to. Unfortunately, we don't have all the time because it's quite a long Q&A period. So I have skipped to his closing speech because I know there was a couple of things in here I wanted to. So I'll play small bits of it and then stop it.
10 minutes.
Thank you, Nick. You are a very genuine and likable person, so
Thank you.
I'm glad this was his first debate, by the way, so did a good job.
That was nice. And just to make a quick comment, as much as I would disagree with Dan Barker, he does seem like he's a nice guy off stage and someone who's likable.
When I went to meet him, he was friendly towards me. I would say, I think we could have had, say, a nice dinner together and just chit-chatted about our differences. I know a lot of atheists who, sadly, are pretty much absolute jerks in everything that they do. Sadly, I also know a lot of Christians who are that same way.
Right, yeah.
But, yeah, that was something nice on his part. I'll grab that.
But he kind of basically proved my point. You see something in the Bible you don't like, just say hyperbole or just say metaphor, and voila, it goes away. You can say that about anything. I can say that about Yahweh. I can say that about the God of the Bible. I don't like him morally. I don't like his actions. So that's why the title of my book is God's the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction. It's all hyperbole. It's all metaphor. The ancient Israelites were telling one huge whopper of a metaphorical tale that made sense to them. Doesn't mean the story itself is.
Well, so this is something he went off on several times. He said, well, listen, the Bible should be plainly understood. Why should Nick have to tell us what it says? Shouldn't we just be able to read it ourselves? Meanwhile, he spent the whole debate telling the audience with his own words what the Bible says, and he had to misrepresent it to make it sound so unpleasant.
It's quite ironic the way that this works out. That Mark Noe wrote a book on the Civil War as a theological crisis, and he said the exact same thing, that Americans, we tend to have this idea that we're a manifest people, that we're chosen, and therefore things should be clear to us, including the Bible. The abolitionists during the Civil War period had the better arguments, but they were more nuanced. They depended on culture and context and history and language. And everyone else said, I'm just opening up and reading what it says, and that's what it means. And that kind of mindset is extremely dangerous because we do not read any other work of literature the same way. We read any other work of literature, we recognize there's hyperbole, there's metaphor, there's simile, there's allegory, there's analogy, there's all these other things. And there is no hard and fast rule to know what is what. There's no magic seer stones that Joseph Smith has. I can tell you what's what in all of this. You actually have to do the work.
Yeah.
And for Dan Barker, I really think his whole argument does kind of boil down to, I don't like what God does, therefore he doesn't exist. That seems to be what it is. It's really an emotional position.
Yeah, and for a guy who accused you of logical fallacies during the debate, that right there is a logical fallacy to say, well, this is a metaphor and this is a metaphor, therefore God is a metaphor. It's like, well, no, Jesus told parables. Does that make Jesus a parable? No, we know Jesus is a historical figure.
Well,
So
keep
like
in
you
mind,
said, you have to do the hard work of separating those things out.
Keep in mind, Dan Barker is a mythicist as well.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that.
Mm.
Darn. Well, I guess him and Richard Carey are the only two people in the world. No, I'm just kidding. But there's a few more, unfortunately, that follow their influence.
True. So, tonight is like a trial, and you are the jury. The prosecution is charging the universe with transcendence or with supernatural or with a God. I, the defense, am simply saying the default position. It looks like there's not, doesn't it? When you look at around, it looks like there's no God. That's what it looks like when you use your eyes and when you live your life, right? So the prosecution has the burden of proof. The defense only has to raise a reasonable doubt. The defense doesn't have to give any proof against that this happened. If they could, well, then there would be no trial, right? It would just be over with. So,
yeah, I don't think he understands how a court trial works. The defense actually has to give evidence. They don't have to prove it was somebody else, but they do have to give evidence that can explain away the prosecution's evidence that they're pointing forth.
Yeah, my biggest problem is the whole thing between atheism as if it's the default position.
Right.
Honestly, whether they're right or wrong for most of human history, atheism has not been the default position most people hold to some form of theism, be it polytheism, animism, something that believes that there's something in this world besides just matter and motion.
Yeah, and his charge that the universe looks as if there's no God, I just don't agree. I mean, first of all, for anyone who's had a personal experience of the Holy Spirit in their lives, we know that's not the case. Of course, you can talk about the evidence, like, creation testifies to a creator, but even something that he would use, like the Holocaust, he might look at the Holocaust and say, well, this is what the universe will look like in the absence of a God. But what I would say is that a universe in the absence of a God, there wouldn't even be moral creatures to, in their hearts, cry out for justice for something like the Holocaust.
I remember reading something several years ago that said, in his own way, we should give Hitler an honorary degree in theology because he showed us how much we need God. I mean, I think it kind of depends on what you look at. I mean, I've told people before that all I need to do is see my wife, who I think is a very beautiful woman, and say, by golly, I have more than enough evidence God exists because I can explain this any other way. If you want to look on evil and suffering, you're going to be convinced likely there is no God. But if you want to look on good, you think there is. G.K. Chesterton once said to his critics that, I'll explain to you the problem of pain when you've explained to me the problem of pleasure. For instance, we have to eat and drink to survive. Who said food and drink had to taste good? We have eyes that we can look at a world. Who says there has to be so much color in it? Who says music has to be beautiful? If the human race has to reproduce to survive, why is it sex had to be made so incredibly awesome then?
Yeah, that's a good point.
So let me ask you, did the prosecution prove its case tonight?
Yes.
Luckily, truth isn't
Proved it.
determined by a majority vote, but yeah.
I suppose we could take a vote. I did a debate at Oxford where they, after the debate at Oxford University, they asked people to vote with their feet. Those for the proposition go through one door, those for the opposition go through the other. 143 people went through Nick's door. 162 people went through my door. So by a vote of Oxford, there is no God. So it depends how this audience is stacked, basically, of what your beliefs are. But no, he did not prove his case. If he did, I would say, wow, there's a God. Wow, it doesn't look like it, but wow, these words that he used actually convinced me. They convinced me that there are people who believe in a God. But
Why would that follow? Why do atheists think, and Michael Jones just recently released a video on his channel Inspiring Philosophy, atheists like to pretend they're so unbiased. If only I were really presented with evidence, I would change my mind on the spot. I don't believe that, especially with the emotion he's expressed in his arguments, the vitriol and the dislike for the character of God of the Bible. I have every reason to think that that's enough of a bias that he would reject any evidence for it.
Yeah, what I like to look at sometimes is the extremes people will go to in making their case. For instance, Peter Boghossian, one of his books says, his book on the Manual of Creating Atheists says something like, if we all went outside at night and all the stars in the sky aligned together and spelled something like, I am God, believe in me. Something of that sort. He said, that could be tentative evidence, but we could all just be experiencing a mass delusion instead. I mean, when you get to that kind of level, you're not talking about someone who's really being rational here.
Yeah.
And I find it interesting that they'll often discount someone's personal experience, which I understand. I don't think you should make an argument based entirely on personal experience, but then say, the only thing that's going to convince me is a personal experience. I've got a quote here from Jerry Coyne's book, Faith versus Fact. Here's what he says, pages 118 and 119. The following, an admittedly contorted scenario, would give me tentative evidence for Christianity. So keep in mind, this is someone would give him tentative evidence. They say, maybe it could be true. Here's all that yes says has to happen. Suppose that a bright light appeared in the heavens and supported by winged angels, a being clad in a white robe and sandals descended onto my campus from the sky, accompanied by a pack of apostles bearing the names given in the Bible. Loud heavenly music with the blaring of trumpets is heard everywhere. The robed being who identifies himself as Jesus repairs to a nearby university hospital, and instantly heals many severely afflicted people, including amputees. After a while, Jesus and his minions, supported by angels, ascend back into the sky with another chorus of music. The heavens swiftly darken, there are flashes of lightning and peals of thunder, and in an instant the sky is clear. If this were all witnessed by others and documented by video, and if the hearings were unexplainable but supported by testimony from multiple doctors, and if all the apparitions and events conform to Christian theology, then I'd have to start thinking seriously about the truth of Christianity. That's a minor request. And when you meet someone like that, then all I have to say is, what you have just told me is you are not really open to evidence because no argument will convince you. You are relying on a personal experience, and I cannot give you a personal experience like that.
Yeah, I know that is just wild. I haven't heard that quote before, but that's really powerful.
Yeah.
Did he connect the dots? He argued for this generic thing up there, simple, whatever, creator, powerful thing of all goodness and beauty. He does these reification things like beauty and truth are existing things outside of ourselves, when that's not true. I don't think philosophy, I don't think even you believe that. Beauty and truth are functions of a brain. When we see something, if the chipmunk in my backyard is looking at the sunset, is the chipmunk saying, oh, that's beautiful? It's not an objective thing. It's something we humans
Well,
are making.
I don't think God created the
decisions
chipmunk with that
in our own
capacity.
minds, and they only
Yeah,
exist as functions of a mind. You can't take a concept and then reify it to turn it into a thing just because we have a word.
Yeah, hit pause
Or-
here at this. This is something else that he said in the debate when he said 2 + 2 = 4 was not true in the time of dinosaurs. And I wish I had jumped on this more, because what that tells me is really there are no eternal truths whatsoever, which means the claim X is evil is also not an eternal truth, which means all his complaints about God at that point go right out the window entirely, because you can't say that there are no truths outside of us. All of this is just a function of our mind, and God is evil. It doesn't work that way. I could say something like that because I do believe in an objective truth. Don't think that one's true. And as for beauty, I make it pretty simple, these guys. I say, hey guys, if you don't believe beauty is objective, then here's how simple it is. You cannot go to your wife and say, you are beautiful, and be making a true statement. You can make a statement about what you think, even though it's a meaningless statement because there's no such thing as beauty, but you can't say it is a true statement. It is absolutely a true statement. If beauty is simply in the eye of the beholder, a stick man that I can draw right here is just as beautiful as the Mona Lisa. The tour shed back here at our apartment complex is just as beautiful as the Taj Mahal. Do we really think that?
Nope, I don't anyway. Yeah, try that out on your wife. Say, well, I like it. I like the way you look. It's not,
Yeah.
You're not really beautiful, but I like it. Go
Yeah.
ahead and try that on your wife. That's not going to look too well.
My wife is beautiful, and that is an objective fact. And if you disagree, you are in the wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah, and his statement about mathematics I noticed was self-defeating, because he tried to give an example. He said, okay, if we're talking just when the dinosaurs are here, and there's 2 apples in this spot right here, and then 2 more apples fall down next to it, how many apples is there? And everybody in the audience said 4, and he goes, nope, there's billions of apples. There's billions of apples in the universe. It takes human minds to start applying equations. And I thought, well, hold on. That's self-defeating because you just used a number, billions, even though it's a general number, but you used a mathematical term to describe how many apples there were in the universe.
And if it requires a mind, well, bingo, we've got it already. God.
Exactly.
So tonight I gave a number of reasons why it's justifiable not to accept the prosecution's charge. The absence of good evidence. I wish we had done the resurrection, because that's at least an honest attempt to provide some evidence. There's a story there. There's a historical story. At least that's an attempt to put something on the table that we can grapple with. Lack of a coherent definition among believers about this God. You know that different believers have different ideas about a God. And even Nick admitted, well, you got to find the right church. You can't just go to any church, right? Even though Paul said, let there be no divisions among you, why are there so many divisions? Who's to say what is the right church? They all think they're the right church, don't they? I did when I was a preacher. Every religion thinks they are the right church, and if you would just see it their way, if you would just be as wise and subtle and understanding and educated as Nick is, and sit there. If God wrote the Bible, it's supposed to be the most important message in the world to the human race, right? And yet none of us can understand it unless some expert and some scholar comes along. The Bible in my hotel.
This is just an unfair charge he made against you. Your claim was like, don't go to a church that isn't equipping you, to give answers and equipping you to actually, engage as are called to be disciples. So that was an unfair charge.
Yeah,
And to say that only, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not at all saying that there's only like one denomination that has it right. I'm not saying you have to go to a Methodist church, you have to go to a Baptist church, you have to go to a Lutheran church. My wife is interested in the Orthodox Church, is attending it. I disagree with a lot of teachings of the Orthodox Church, but I'd say you can find Jesus there just as much. I know some people have a lot of problem with that, but I'm around these people. I don't have any reason to doubt they're Christians. And the priest there who likes both of us, he looks at me, he doesn't have any reason to doubt I'm a Christian. He looks at my wife who's not baptized in the church yet. He doesn't have any reason to think she's not a Christian. I don't have a problem with any of those.
Yeah. Yeah, and he seemed to say, well, the resurrection, that would at least be evidence, but not this other stuff. It's like, well, no, philosophical evidence is evidence. I'm sorry it wasn't the topic you might have wanted, Dan Barker. And as you said during the debate, hey, if you want to do another debate on the resurrection specifically, we can do that, but that wasn't the topic for this debate.
Let's go. I'm ready when
yeah,
he wants to.
Absolutely. And I hear this from so many atheists. Well, if God isn't the author of confusion, why is there so many different denominations? Why is the Bible so hard to understand? Well, so long as the central message of Jesus Christ is easy to understand, which it is, and this is what missionaries take all over the world, and there are many different denominational forms. We can have those minor differences as long as as long as Christ is at the center. Then dividing over minor differences, again, as long as we're all brothers and sisters in Christ, it's not the same thing.
Yeah, I think I'll go with something that Mark Twain actually said here. He said, it's not the things in the Bible that I don't understand that trouble me. It's the things that I do understand that trouble me. And heck, if Dan wants about things in the Bible that he doesn't like, there are a lot of things in the Bible I don't like. I don't like being told that I'm a sinner. I don't like being told that I need to repent. I don't like being told that I can't do many things I would like to do, but that they're wrong to do. I don't like that.
Yeah.
Hotel room that the Gideons put there. It doesn't come with a scholar. If you can't just open it and read it like a normal human being would read any other book, then God is inept. He failed to communicate his message to us clearly. If the trumpet give an uncertain sound, who will march to battle? The Bible should be able to be picked up and just read by any of us without a PhD in Hebrew languages or philosophy or something. If it doesn't, then we are captives to people like Nick who are going to tell us what it really means. I think you would rather think for yourself, wouldn't you? You would rather say, wait a minute, let me make my decision. I encourage you to read the Bible. Please. I'm reading through the Quran again, just to know the Islamic thought. Read the Quran. See what it actually says.
Well, first of all, Dan, again, you spent the whole debate telling us what the Bible said. So why do we need you to tell us, Dan? And second of all, I didn't realize that God was required to write at a third grade level.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is that there are many cultures today, many languages, many different things. One word you can say over here could be taken a completely different way somewhere else. I mean, there's a guy, Mark Gungor, who does Laugh Your Way to a Better Marriage. And he talked about being in England and saying to his kid once, maybe he goes, come over here, you little booger. Well, to us, that seems fun and innocent. To them, that was making some sort of sexual slang. You have this going on. So that's why the Bible comes with in a specific language that can be translated for everyone else to understand, or else you have each different country and tribe and each having their own supposed Bible that somehow falls from heaven, and where are they going to go in? And Dan saying, think for yourself. Okay, I agree. And do the same thing with the Bible. Think for yourself about the Bible. Study the Bible. The whole thing I think the Bible tells us is if you want to know if it's true, you will study it. and you will seek to learn about it. And I'd like to make a brief aside here, but I agree with him also about, reading other books. I've read the Quran.
Hmm.
I've read the Mormon scriptures, and it's very helpful to do something like that. I remember debating a Muslim on Facebook once sometime, and he said, well, and I said, have you ever read the New Testament? He said, no. Have you ever read the Quran? Yes.
Yeah.
I think if you're a Christian, you're wanting to minister to other faiths, you owe it to yourself to read their holy books.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a great point.
There's obviously a lot of theodicies to the problem of evil, but there's not a good answer. And some of you ask questions about evil in the world. Evil is also not just moral evil, it's also natural evil. There's a forest fire and the deers are running away, but the little fawn gets her leg caught in a branch and dies this horrible death from pain and agony as the fire kills it. Whose character was built? What lesson was learned from something like that? We all know that the universe we live in, this world we live in, is cruel and random, and it could happen to any one of us without any reason, without any cause. So these theodicies that are given by Hicks or Plattinger or others are sort of ad hoc explanations to try to make this God of theirs good. I'm not saying that this proves there's no God. And I think I was very careful in my statement to say that I'm not saying this proves there's no God. It does prove that there's no good God. If there is a God, he might as well be more of a monster or an evil God for the way he is treating human beings on this planet.
Well, if he actually understood sophisticated philosophy, he would know that there can't be a God that is evil would be a logical contradiction. Because God, by definition, is the greatest conceivable being, so he'd be all good. And you know what I find interesting is Graham Oppy, who's a famous atheist, came to the exact opposite conclusion that Dan did. Dan says, well, there's just no good answer to the problem of evil. Graham Oppy, when asked about the problem of evil, said, well, there really is no successful logical argument from the problem of evil, so apologists don't even need to worry about it because there is no good argument from evil. I found that so interesting.
Yeah, and actually, I come at it from a different approach from you. I don't do the greatest conceivable being theology. I just go straight through the Thomistic perspective, and even an evil God doesn't make sense because goodness and being are equated in this. And I'm thinking, I don't recognize Dan Barker's universe, because in Dan Barker's universe, it looks like any one of us could just find merciless death waiting for us every single day, and most of us honestly do not live in that terror.
Yeah.
I suspect Dan Barker is going to go to sleep tonight and assume that if he has good health, he's got so many more years, he'll get in his car and drive somewhere and assume he's going to reach his destination safely. He'll go into a public place where several people are and assume no one there is waiting to kill him. All of this stuff. And interesting, if you go to some third world countries where they don't think that way, where reality is very different and death could be there any moment, they don't complain about evil like we do.
Yeah. And to his example of the deer getting caught in the thickets, I'll just let people know I'm planning on having Dr. Trent Doherty on the show soon to talk about the problem of evil. And he has some really interesting arguments about animal evil and how God could actually have an ultimate good for the animals themselves. It's a really interesting argument. So I'd like to let people know to look out for that.
I think if life is eternal, then life is cheap. We should not want life to be eternal. We give more value to things that are rare and precious, don't we? Precious metals, precious things. If things are plentiful, then their value goes down. So believers like Nick and like some of you in this audience think you're going to live forever. Well, that cheapens your life. We atheists know that it's going to end, and it's going to end for good, and that's it. We know that. That adds value to life. It makes it more precious because it is rare. When a little child dies from something, in spite of their parents praying for God to save them, we feel really horrible. We feel horrible when an old person dies too, right? We feel horrible. But we seem to feel more horrible when it's a child because there's so much more that's lost because the preciousness of the life. We atheists actually appreciate and value life more than believers do because we know this is it. This is our one shot. We're not going to sacrifice the goodness that we find in this world, minimizing of harm, just because we have some hope of something above and beyond. That's kind of egotistical when you think about that.
So I'm going to cut him off there. We'll bring the show to a close. That is just an unjustified charge there. And he's confused two things, both of which, by the way, you can't have on atheism, but he's confused value and ultimate purpose. So yes, even if, say, life weren't eternal, if there were a God who could endow humanity with value, we could still have value, but even that would only be from the Creator. Only that would be because we were made in the image. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. Only because we were made in the image of God. But to think that, atheists value life more because it's not eternal, it's like, well, if it's not eternal, then it doesn't matter. If a child suffers and dies, there is no ultimate justice. As you point out, there's no ultimate justice for those who died in the Holocaust.
We could just as well say, well, we're going to go off and kill half the people on the planet. We're going to do the Thanos thing. And once we do that, life would be more valuable at that point. That doesn't follow. Some things are more valuable because they are rare. Human life is valuable because of what it is.
Mm-hmm.
If you have 2 humans, they're still valuable. If you have 4 humans, they're just as valuable. If you have 4 billion, they're each still just as valuable.
Yeah.
Every single life is valuable.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I guess just in closing, when I first watched the debate, I wrote some rather harsh comments in it. I said, listening to Dan Barker explain the Bible is like listening to a 2-year-old explain quantum mechanics. So, I admit I have a bit of a temper there, but I would say, well, when I kind of sit back and reflect on it, I would say Dan Barker does seem like a nice guy. I think, I could, like you said, sit down, have dinner with him, enjoy him as a person, enjoy him as a friend. And I would like to extend that invitation out to Dan Barker. If he were to somehow see this, that I'd love him to come on my show and have a conversation. I would absolutely love to meet him. But his ideas, I do think, unfortunately, he has some very unsophisticated, unintellectual ideas. And so I am rather merciless in tackling the ideas.
Yeah, the ideas, I think, are what's problematic there. That, to me, they're very emotionally laden. And that's the only way I think the problem of evil works. The problem of evil works because it grips our emotions so much. I think, though, for me, when I go through suffering, my fear isn't that atheism is true. It's instead more like what C.S. Lewis said. There is a God, and this is what he's really like. And that's a concern that we can often go through, but I realize it's emotional when I go through it.
Yeah. I as a very young teenager, one thing I did struggle with was, certain depression and issues that I had. But through all that, I never stopped believing in God. It was always that I thought maybe God didn't care about me or, whatever the case may be. Thankfully, apologetics came into my life and gave me a more humble understanding of the universe. But yeah, I guess, do you have any closing thoughts?
Well, I say thanks for coming on, and I definitely would say to Dan, you want to talk about the resurrection sometime? Let's do it. I'm open. But really, thanks for having me on. Encourage people to go to my YouTube channel, Deeper Waters Apologetics, my podcast, the Deeper Waters Podcast. All of us at deeperwatersapologetics.com. And in case I didn't say earlier, I do want everyone to know that I affirm the virgin birth.
Yes, I also affirm the virgin birth, and perhaps I can do a post and send it to you about the evidence for the virgin birth. So yeah, definitely the YouTube channel, all the things that Nick just mentioned, everybody, will be links in the description, so it'll be very easy for you guys to find if you go down there and check there. Also, if you're new to this channel, please subscribe, hit notification bells, because subscriptions don't mean a whole lot. And if you were interested in supporting this ministry, you can head on over to subscribestar.com/TUA, $10 a month. There you get early access to interviews like with Mike Jones, the web extended with Mike Jones. And until then, Nick Peters, thank you so much for taking the time, brother, and hopefully we get to do it again soon.
Thank you, and I'd love to come back again.